Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today with another episode of the Media Freedom Rapid Response webinars. We are here to discuss the findings of the MFRR's latest Media Freedom Monitoring Report, which takes stock of the state of press and media freedom across 27 EU member states and 9 candidate countries. Media freedom is a cornerstone of democracy, yet journalists across Europe are facing growing hostility from online harassment to smear campaigns to physical attacks, legal threats, and political pressure. Monitoring these violations is not only about numbers and statistics, it is about documenting the reality on the ground, amplifying the voices of those who are affected, and ensuring that their struggles are visible to policymakers and the public. Without this evidence, it is too easy for threats to media freedom to be ignored. And during today's webinar, it's an opportunity for us to reflect on these challenges, highlight key trends, and think together about how we can better protect journalists and safeguard media freedom in Europe. With that, I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers who will guide us through the report and share their insights. Today, we are welcoming Kara Rekar, the monitoring officer from the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, Camille Magnisalis, Press Freedom Monitoring and Communications Officer at the European Federation of Journalists, Ronja Koskinen, Press Freedom Officer at the International Press Institute, and Teona Sekniashvili, European Network and Advocacy Officer at the International Press Institute. And I am going to be the moderator today, Gürkan Özturan from also the European Center for Press and Media Freedom. Kara, can we start with you? Can you please give us a brief overview of the first half of 2025 from a media freedom perspective? What do the findings of the Media Freedom Monitoring Report that covers the period from January to June tell us?
Yes, thank you, Gürkan, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us. I've been tasked with giving sort of the general overview of the findings. Before that, just to add, for those who are not familiar with the monitoring report, which has launched yesterday, it's a publication that we launch every 6 months to have a half-year and full-year assessment of the press freedom situation in Europe. We do this by monitoring press freedom violations as the MFR monitoring team, and you can find everything that we discuss, so all the cases and all the numbers I will mention in this report that you can access on mfr.eu. And we also publish all the individual cases that we talk about on our monitoring database, which is called mappingmediafreedom.org. But just to begin, so what did we see in the first 6 months of 2025? In total, we documented over 700 press freedom violations, 709, which affected 1,249 media workers, organizations, or related persons like advisors or family members. Verbal attacks were the most prominent. So if we look at all the attacks that we documented, about 40 were verbal attacks. This includes insults, harassments, threats like death threats, or also smear campaigns. A lot of the verbal attacks that we saw happened online. So it was about 40% of all the verbal attacks. We also documented close to 100 physical attacks. Here we distinguish between physical attacks that resulted in injury and those that don't. About 1/3 of the physical attacks that we documented were serious enough to result in injury. We saw that private individuals were the most common perpetrator behind physical attacks, followed by police. And we also saw, when we looked at sort of the context of physical attacks, that most of them happened when journalists were out on reporting assignments, especially when reporting on public protests or events that took place in public spaces. Similarly, in these sort of contexts, we also documented attacks on property. So these are attacks on cameras or recording equipment, for example. But also when we look at property attacks, what I wanted to highlight was incidents of hacking or DDoS attacks, which are distributed denial of service attacks. Here we documented 15 cases, and these are especially serious because they can shut down media outlets or like the online presence of media outlets. for a significant amount of time, and at the same time they're incredibly costly, and it's almost impossible to tell who's behind these attacks. So 15 cases in the first 6 months is quite a lot. We also document cases that we classify as interference. Most of these include evidence of blocking journalistic activity, so when journalists are not allowed to access reporting locations, when they were denied access to information, or when they were hindered in the distribution of their work. Under interference, we also documented 23 cases of editorial interference, which are quite serious. Here, journalists were censored in some shape or form, pre or post publication. And we also documented cases of administrative and financial interference. So in these cases, media outlets had to shut down because of financial cuts or because their licenses were withdrawn. A last sort of trend or type of attack I want to mention before I give the floor to my colleagues is that we saw quite a high number of legal attacks. 1/4 of all the attacks that we monitored were legal attacks. And these include incidents of arrests over that journalists were arrested over their reporting. These include lawsuits, incidents like fines, but also legislative initiatives, so laws or regulations that restrict or threaten media freedom in some shape or form. And here we documented 22 legislative initiatives across 12 of the countries that we monitor. And these are incredibly concerning because they threaten press and media freedom in Europe structurally and likely for the long term. But I will stop here because my colleague Ronja has a lot more to say about this. And just to reiterate, if you have questions about any of these numbers, please take a look at the monitoring report, or you can also ask any questions in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara, for this reminder also. I was also going to ask our viewers to submit their questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And Ronja, foreign agent laws. We have heard how governments are increasingly use foreign agent narratives. Could you explain why these laws and accusations are so dangerous for journalists and independent media in Europe?
Thank you, Gurkan and Kara. So this, let's say, so-called foreign agent laws are extremely dangerous for press freedom because they don't just regulate funding, for example. They also stigmatize journalists as traitors or serving foreign powers. And this foreign agent label and also these accusations related to foreign funding or foreign influence, they undermine trust in media. They fuel smear campaigns against journalists and media outlets, and they can also justify censorship and surveillance. So in practice, they weaken independent outlets that often rely on international grants to survive, while also giving governments a tool to silence watchdog reporting under the guise of protecting sovereignty, for example. During the monitoring period, we recorded 45 violations related to foreign agent laws or accusations of foreign influence, affecting a total of 63 journalists, media outlets, or media-related organizations across Europe. The problem was most prominent in like Central and Eastern Europe, but we saw these cases across the board in different countries. More than half of these incidents came directly from government or public officials, which was very alarming. The most common type of violation we recorded was verbal attacks, like smear campaigns or discrediting. And these made up almost 2/3 of the cases. And this was followed by legal and legislative actions that were the second most common type of violation. So as we can see, it's not just about the laws, these foreign agent laws. It's also about this hostile political rhetoric that kind of paints foreign-funded journalism as disloyal, biased, or even dangerous. And next, I'm going to give some country examples. Excuse me, my cat really wants to participate. I think the most alarming example that we had in the EU was Hungary. It was the clearest example of this foreign agent type of issue within the European Union. In early 2025, Prime Minister Viktor Orban's government introduced the so-called on the transparency of public life. This bill gives the Sovereignty Protection Office sweeping powers to investigate and blacklist any entity deemed to threaten Hungary's sovereignty. Although media was not explicitly named in this bill, the language is very broad and vague. Basically, any organization that influences public opinion, falls under this legislation, and this means that it also targets independent media outlets which are relying on EU or international grants. The law also invoked vague concepts like defending Christian culture and constitutional identity, which also opens the door for arbitrary enforcement. Domestic protests and also international criticism and pushback led to delays. So the bill has not been voted on yet. It will probably come soon. But yeah, the intention is clear. Foreign-funded journalism is, framed as illegitimate. Another very worrying cases that we had in Hungary related to these foreign agent narratives. The Sovereignty Protection Office, or SPO, targeted independent outlets on multiple occasions, with like smear campaigns and, investigations and so on. We also saw several pretty serious cases of discredit and smear campaigns by Prime Minister Orban and other Fidesz politicians. And this situation escalated in spring when Orban used a major rally to attack groups critical of his government, including independent media, called them bugs who should be eradicated, and also accused these groups of serving interests of the European Union and a liberal American empire, and of being paid by them. And also, according to media reports that we saw, a Hungarian intelligence agency was reportedly tasked by the Prime Minister with compiling a report and a list of Hungarian NGOs and media outlets that have received any foreign funding over the past decade. This was also very worrying. So the situation is pretty critical in Hungary. Also in Slovakia, the parliament passed a fast-tracked transparency law in April. This law basically requires NGOs, which also many news outlets are, to disclose all donors over 5,000 euros and list their board members publicly. While explicit labels like foreign agent or lobbyist were dropped from the final version of the law after pushback, the obligations were seen as intrusive, and the rhetoric around them, had similarities to the atmosphere in Hungary, for example. Also, Prime Minister Robert Fico requested Elon Musk, this American business person, to provide information on media and journalists in Slovakia funded by USAID. I think also a very worrying example during the monitoring period was Georgia, and my colleague Teona will talk more about that soon. Just to conclude, what kind of consequences, for journalists these laws and these narratives have, because they do go far beyond just the legislation, which is in itself is really serious. But these journalism media outlets labeled as dollar media or Soros media, or foreign agents are exposed to smear campaigns, harassment, and this could also lead to physical threats in the end. And these attacks are especially alarming and damaging in fragile media markets, where these international grants are often the only lifeline for independent reporting. And the collapse of the USAID global funding under the Trump administration earlier this year made it even worse, because many outlets in Europe were cut off from their funding resources, while at the same time this situation and Trump administration's hostile rhetoric around USAID provided these, let's say, authoritarian-minded governments in Europe with fresh ammunition to discredit any media linked to US or EU support. So in short, these foreign agent laws and narratives are being used not to make funding transparent, but to delegitimize oh my god, I can't pronounce that word, delegitimize, defund, and ultimately silence independent journalism. And what we see across Europe is a clear pattern, governments claiming to defend sovereignty, while in reality eroding press freedom and restricting the public's access to reliable information. And foreign funding is not in itself a threat to democracy. It is often what keeps independent journalism alive. And the real threat is the political weaponization of the foreign agent label. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronja, for this comprehensive overview on foreign agency and foreign agent laws. And then we go to Georgia as a country that has significantly been impacted by these narratives in the last year. And Teona, please give us an overview, and how has the Georgian media responded to the crackdown in the past months? And are they resisting on the ground, relocating into exile, or seeking alternative sources of funding at the moment?
Thank you, Gorkan. Yes, you're absolutely right. During this period, Georgia has been moving closer to becoming a fully consolidated authoritarian regime. And the ruling Georgian Dream regime has used a wide range of tools at its disposal to stifle dissent, curtail critical voices, and primarily they have done this by eroding media freedom, by cracking down on independent journalism. Yes, as Ronja mentioned, and as you said yourself, foreign agent laws has been a big problem in Georgia. I would not call this only just foreign agent laws. These are laws, repressive laws that are related to content and funding of independent media and non-government organizations. So I want to touch upon a few things besides these repressive laws. Now, as I said, the Georgian Dream has used wide range of tools to suppress media freedom, and besides repressive legislation, this has been unlawful imprisonment, economic persecution of independent journalists and independent newsrooms, arbitrary fines that were imposed on journalists, also smear campaigns that just continued. This is not big news in case of Georgia, and also full capture, finalizing the capture of the public service media of Georgia's public broadcaster. So before again I dive into different kind of repressive legislation, I want to start speaking about Zia Maglobeli, who is about whom we have put out a few statements from the MFRR, who is founder and director of two of the most prominent leading independent media outlets in Georgia, Net Gazeti and Batu Melabi. These news outlets have exposed corruption and human rights violations in Georgia for over 25 years, and have been a big problem, quote unquote, for the Georgian Dream regime as well. She was arrested in early January, on politically motivated charges for, I think, attacking a police officer, and her health and eyesight have been really deteriorating while in prison. She faced smear campaigns, economic retaliation, and harassment. And despite international calls for her release, including the calls from the MFRR consortium, in August, she was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and we'll be keeping a close eye on this case, and we'll keep demanding her release. I should also mention that during the pre-trial detention period, she was subjected to humiliating and dehumanizing treatment, and according to what she said, but these cases have not been investigated. As for the foreign agent laws, we have recorded 6 of this during the reporting period, 6 of the restrictive laws. The one was Foreign Agents Registration Act that the Georgian Dream regime adopted, which basically criminalizes foreign funding for media and non-governmental organizations. The penalties in case of non-compliance include fines up to $10,000 or 5 years imprisonment. I mean, the scope of FARA, of the Foreign Agents Registration Act in the US, and this law is a literal translation of the US FARA, has been significantly limited through case law in the US and has been really rarely employed against the non-governmental organizations or non-profits beyond their registration. But in case of Georgia, there was an expectation that this law would be weaponized against CSOs and independent media. And it already started to be weaponized against CSOs. The bank accounts of a few leading human rights CSOs, including those who work on media freedom, have been frozen, and their heads have been interrogated. That's just happened a few weeks ago. Then there was also like amendments to the law on broadcasting, which basically banned foreign funding for broadcasters. It also expanded powers of Georgia's Communication Commission, a regulatory body, which is captured by the Georgian Dream regime. And this law, these amendments have been also weaponized already against media. It was already used against leading government critical channels, including Formula TV and TV Pirveli. There were also like amendments in the law on freedom of speech and courts. So the courts reporting has been almost fully restricted. So journalists cannot freely report from the courts. And the recording has been also banned. So it's very difficult for journalists to get the information out from the courts. And there are many cases of many politically motivated cases that they cannot report on anymore. One more law that I will mention, and I really recommend that the listeners will, attendees of this webinar, will read the alerts and also the Georgia report chapter, because I think it's impossible to explain in such a short time how damaging and harmful all these laws are. But the final one that I want to quickly examine is the loan grants. So foreign donors might have to, from April on, after this law was adopted, have to receive state approval from the Georgian government to fund independent media or NGOs. And if permission is denied, accepting a grant will result in a fine equal to twice the grant amount. So basically, to sum it all up, most of the independent media in Georgia was dependent on foreign funding, but now foreign funding is in fact banned in Georgia. Also, just to bring up some really important numbers from the monitoring. So we have documented overall 72 alerts, 72 incidents that involved 107 media related persons or entities. What is really like kind of what I can say shocking or different in case of Georgia is that in most cases, the recorded violations were perpetrated by the country's judiciary branch, followed by government or public officials, and finally police and state security forces. So state actors were the main perpetrators of these attacks. We have also documented cases of physical attacks. 19 media workers have been physically attacked. Again, this only just in the last, from January to June, because from November until June, over 100 media professionals have been attacked physically. But again, what is very important here is also to note that none of these cases of physical attacks have been fully investigated and perpetrators have not been held accountable. And I did mention that the Georgian Dream kind of finalized the capture of the public broadcaster, and I wanted to say a few words about that as well. Well, Georgian public broadcaster has long served as an instrument of the government, of the Georgian Dream ruling party, and journalists have reported before as well that they could not report free of political control. But during this period, those journalists who publicly spoke up against the Georgian Dream related or controlled management of the public broadcaster have been fired. This included the anchor of a major news program, Vasil Ivanov-Chikovani, as well as Nino Zautashvili, who was a host of one of the major political talk shows. And after they were fired, the 5 additional journalists were also dismissed, and they have spoken after their dismissal also very explicitly about the pressure that they have been facing from the management of the public broadcaster. And the public broadcaster continues to report clearly biased. Its reporting is clearly biased in favor of the ruling Georgian Dream Party as well. And to answer your question, Gurkan, about how the Georgian media is, pushing back, how they are fighting back. First, I would say that maybe it's a subjective observation, but I think that's a very resistant media. Obviously, the journalist has become a dangerous profession in the country, and there are some discussions about moving into exile, especially on international forums. But from the conversations with us, with the MFRR monitoring team, and the consortium, what we hear is that most journalists do not want to move abroad. Some say that they'd rather be arrested than work in exile. And again, like the foreign funding cannot be available for them anymore. But what they did was to launch a Lights campaign. That's how it's called, the Lights campaign. This is a very large crowdfunding campaign. 22 independent newsrooms in Georgia have united to raise money from the public. I mean, as I understand, this campaign is quite successful now, and yeah, they try to, do anything what they can, anything at their disposal to keep operating in Georgia. I just shared the link of the Lights campaign. The website says the lights must stay on, freedom to museum, freedom to political prisoners of conscience. So yes, that's briefly it. Yes, this okay, yeah. Overall, the situation, media freedom situation in Georgia is really grim, and we can just say again, repeat what we said also during the previous webinar, that the pace of the deterioration of media freedom and of democratic freedoms is really unprecedented.
Thank you so much, Teona. And from the Caucasus now we go to the Balkans. Camille, we have been seeing the developments in Serbia more and more often in the news for the last few months. But for our viewers, can you please elaborate on why did Serbia appear as a thematic chapter in this report, and what are the types of violations that the journalists and media are experiencing in Serbia?
Thanks, Gurkan, and hello to everyone. Thank you for being here. Yes, Serbia, we keep saying it because it's very important that everyone, especially at the international community, hear this message. What's going on there is not business as usual. We are talking about an emergency situation. Since the fatal collapse of the Novi Sad train station canopy on 1st November last year, the journalists have been faced with unprecedented government pressure, repression for all their reporting about the anti-corruption protests, and the attacks that we are witnessing there are completely irreconcilable with the EU standards. So we were so alarmed by the surge of attacks, and it's even getting worse at the moment we are talking. That's the MFRR delegation. So we decided to went to Serbia to help this solidarity mission, which was actually the first time that we were doing a solidarity mission, meaning no meetings at the political level, to show support and solidarity with the journalists and also assess the practical needs. And even during the mission, we were alarmed by so much cases that we were even not aware of. Very shocking. Journalists are targeted by any means for reporting truth, and especially the independent media, of course. And even despite all the recommendations and all our calls to the EU for stronger and decisive actions, we are appalled by the increasingly violent repression by the law enforcement. They have completely shifted from inaction to direct confrontation with any journalist covering the protests, physical attacks, use of dangerous tear gas components as well, arrest. At least 30 journalists and media workers have been affected, and the journalism students are far from being spared from those attacks. Verbal attacks by government officials, including the Serbian president Aleksandar Vučić and officials from the ruling party, aim to portraying independent media as political opponents. This persists really as a significant concern because the dangerous rhetorics which the pro-government tabloids then amplify fuel the most horrific threats perpetrated then by private individuals in this climate of impunity, because the investigation starts but rarely ends. And as a prime example, after President Vučić recently labeled the N1 television and Nova S for their independent reporting, so he labeled them as a pure terrorism, doing pure terrorism, basically just after N1 was threatened with 6 death threats online, but they also received a letter to the newsroom threatening them with a Charlie Hebdo. So you can really see that also it's not only about online threats, but it can also escalate beyond the screen, including letters. The political pressure is also contagious within the newsroom. N1 Nova, their future of those two main TV station independent broadcaster is uncertain, also due to the leadership changes with the United Group, risk of political interference. We recently found out about an audio between the CEO of the United Group and the Telecom Serbia discussing the need to dismiss at the alleged request of the President Vučić, the executive director of the United Group, because it was too complicated to change the N1 director. There are this risk and those assumptions of political interference that we need to be very aware of. And those N1 and Nova also were dropped from the Total TV satellites. So uncertain future for independent broadcaster, and basically anyone defending commitment to ethical journalism is being forced or to be dismissed from their media, Euronews Serbia, El Serbia, Vestant Novosti, Politica, and even RTS, despite being faced with strong criticism from the student movement for their reporting and long-term political capture. Even then, they are faced with political pressure. And amid this political capture, the recent unlawful election process of the new members of the Council of the Regulatory Body for Electronic Media was once again one mockery of EU required reforms. So therefore, it was really important for us to answer the question to have Serbia in the chapter, because it was a mean for us to keep showing solidarity with the journalists, to highlight once again our findings from the mission in Serbia, and also the daily monitoring, which is keep worsening, and honestly the numbers of attacks are exploding, and it's very complicated also for the media representatives also being targeted for defending the journalists. So my main message would be to keep talking about Serbia, raising awareness about Serbia, and advocating for all the journalists across Serbia, because we cannot remain silent or ignore what's going on there. We need the EU and the international community to react before there's no return possible, basically, with a press freedom that would fall entirely under repression.
Thank you so much, Camille. We will come back to you, but first, now we would like to have a look at Romania. The monitoring efforts in Romania show a spike in violations around the annulled elections. And Ronya, can you tell us what role did the far-right actors play in creating a hostile environment for journalists during the coverage period of the report?
Thank you, Gürkan. Yes, what we saw during the monitoring period, far-right actors were definitely a dominant source of violations. After the first round of the presidential elections was annulled due to the Constitutional Court ruled that there was evidence of Russian interference. Due to this, there were a lot of protests where journalists were harassed and attacked, specifically like right-wing protests. And, then the situation also escalated into smear campaigns online, for example. And these actions created a climate of intimidation and, undermined press freedom during a very fragile political moment. We recorded 24 press freedom violations during the monitoring period, affecting 46 journalists and media outlets. And this kind of political instability or turmoil created a really fertile ground for far-right mobilization, protests, smear campaigns. And independent journalists were kind of caught in the middle of that. The most common violations we recorded were verbal attacks, making up nearly half of the cases, closely followed by legal incidents and different forms of interference. And what is interesting, I think, is that half of the violations were committed by private individuals, including far-right activists and supporters, but also political actors played a major role. And we had 14 alerts directly connected to the election period, which was also interesting and alarming at the same time. And from these cases, we identified 11 incidents involving far-right actors harassing or obstructing journalists, both during the protests and also online. So in January, after the annulment of the first round of the elections, far-right groups led by Kalin Georgescu took to the streets, and there was, for example, one weekend of protests where we documented 4 press freedom violations, harassment of TV crews, and even physical attacks on journalists. And later in May, when a new round of elections was scheduled, George Simeon from the Our party emerged as the new far-right frontrunner. And, you know, leading up to the elections, Simeon escalated his attacks on media. For example, he verbally targeted outlets such as G4 Media and Hot News, accusing them of bias and double standards and so on. And then he also published a secretly recorded conversation with Digi24 journalists on Facebook in an attempt to discredit and humiliate them. And I think these incidents really highlight how election periods, you know, can become this kind of breaking points for harassment and smear campaigns against journalists. Beyond the elections, we also saw worrying patterns of online harassment and legal pressure. For example, you know, Elon Musk amplified a disinformation campaign against ActiveWatch, you know, human rights and breast freedom NGO in Romania. And around the same time, investigative outlet Context was targeted with a very interesting case. Part of it was this so-called de-indexing. So these like anonymous users copy news articles, let's say about a specific business person, and they copy these critical articles, backdate them and publish them on, let's say, like blogging platforms, for example. And then they send, you know, these kind of false copyright claims, you know, saying that their text was the original one and that the fake news article should be taken down from Google search results. This is very alarming and actually, you know, quite effective way to silence critical reporting. So this happened regarding critical reporting about a business person, Jürgen Pfaff, and his company, Fly Lily. So yeah, you know, critical articles started disappearing from Google searches, and of course, like, you know, we can't verify if this was done by Pfaff and his associates, but when Context asked him about this, you know, if he had anything to do with this de-indexing campaign, Pfaff actually sued Context and, you know, in an attempt to block further reporting on him. We also saw a very worrying case. Investigative reporter Victor Ili revealed that he had been surveilled for 2 months, I think in 2023, by the National Anti-Corruption Directorate while working undercover on a grain trade investigation. And yeah, this was a, you know, kind of clear case of state overreach against investigative journalism. Also, later in May, police raided the home of photojournalist Andrei Bunchowski. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. And, you know, they seized images he had taken at a far-right commemoration event. We also had serious cases of intimidation and threats. Most alarming was when 3 current and former Press One journalists received death threats online after, you know, reporting on this kind of neo-Nazi group that has been recruiting young people on social media platforms. And finally, we also saw one worrying legal development. The Constitutional Court actually struck down provisions requiring public officials to publish their asset declarations, and this was a serious setback for transparency and, you know, accountability journalism. And when we take all this together, I think these cases show how in Romania this political instability and far-right mobilization, you know, kind of when you combine these elements, with state interference and these legal rollbacks, they really create a hostile environment for independent journalism. And journalists face threats both on the streets and online, as well as lawsuits and surveillance and even a raid. And I think this kind of mix of pressure points really risks silencing critical voices at a moment when accountability and public interest reporting is needed more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronya, once again. And finally, we go back to Camille now to talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina and how it was reflected in the monitoring report. The report shows a significant increase in the press and media freedom violations in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And Camille, in your view, which factors have been most influential in this rise? Government rhetoric, police interventions, or is it the legal pressures?
Thank you, Gürkan. Yes, Bosnia, as you mentioned, and Herzegovina is faced with an increase in attacks on media workers. As a matter of fact, we have, for the first 6 months, 33 media workers being affected compared to 21 for the whole year of 2024. Verbal attacks are the most common type of violation during this monitoring period, followed by interference and physical attacks. The most disturbing fact, I would say, is that nearly of the incidents were perpetrated by governments and public officials, including through verbal attacks, interference. But I would like first to mention one thing is that Bosnia is also concerned by the so-called foreign agent law in the Republika Srpska that may serve as an additional dangerous tool of further pressure against government critics. And you can see that as regards the verbal attacks and the discrediting statements, the independent media are targeted and suspected of receiving the USAID foreign funded support. That's the basic rhetoric, saying that they are criminals, politically instructed, including by Republika Srpska President Milorad Dodik. So you can see how it's also reflecting in the verbal attacks, plus the interference with the journalist work is also a matter of concern, with a total of 5 incidents, also some involving the President Dodik, and also this all hostile climate and increased attacks. Journalists are also threatened with death. This time we recorded 3 actually death threats, but one perpetrated by private individuals. But one was also directed against the journalist Natasha Miljanovic-Zubak. So this journalist is already faced with at least 7 criminal acts since the arson attack on her car in 2022. This threat was she was threatened with decapitation. And plus recently her case attracted a lot our attention because she was faced with criminal charges for disclosing secret data over her investigation into potential criminal activities within the police forces. The charges were dismissed, but we cannot really forget how she was arrested, her family house raid, and one of her confiscated phone was used without due process, also endangering her sources. So yes, it's very problematic, and she was not the only one also threatened. One case with the TV journalist Dino Dormic and his child was also concerning because it was over its reporting on an international police operation, and one of the suspects threatened them. And I would say that it's something that I can see is that journalists and their families are often expressly mentioned also as a mean to intimidate, of course, the journalists, which is horrible. In terms of physical attacks, we recorded 3 compared to incidents last year. So we cannot talk about a surge of increase, but yeah, we need to be careful and to keep providing also practical support to the journalists. Also, in one of the cases, the equipment was damaged, so which we did. And finally, because it's hard to summarize Bosnia and Herzegovina, but I really want to address my last words to our colleagues from Al Jazeera, who experienced student closure recently after 14 years of continuous broadcasting. We believe, and we really believe it will have a serious impact on media pluralism in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as the entire region.
Thank you, Camille, and thank you, everyone, Kara, Teona, and Ronya. Also, thank you for such a brilliant work on the monitoring report as well. This was the last half-year report that we have published, and the next one will be available as the annual report, which should be published in February 2026. These reports and these webinars have been powered by the Media Freedom Rapid Response Consortium. The MFRR tracks, monitors, and reacts to violations of press and media freedom in EU member states and candidate countries. And this project provides also legal and practical support, public advocacy, and information to protect journalists and media workers. The MFRR is organized by an alliance led by the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, including Article 19 Europe, the European Federation of Journalists, Free Press Unlimited, International Press Institute, and Balkani Caucasus Trans Europa OBCT. The project is commenced in 2020 and is co-funded by the European Commission. Thank you for watching us.